Hi, I'm Rick Van Davendijk. I'm from Dutch Growers Garden Center. We're going to be talking a little bit today about pruning. First thing I like to start off with is just the type of tools you need. That's the most important thing you want to know about. And the things you want to need first of all is just a pair of hand pruners. Hand pruners is probably the number one, and there's all different types, sizes, everything else. This one here is a Corona, or another one's called Falcos. They're very similar to this. They'll probably last you a lifetime. You can probably hand them on to your grandchildren if you wanted to. They're very well, and there's some that are a lot cheaper. They'll work just as well. But you just need, the biggest thing you need for these kind of pruners is just keep them sharp and keep them clean. That's the number one thing, and you can do a lot of pruning when you're doing these kind of things. And so pruning of these ones is very simple to do. All you do is when you're pruning it, you can see like this pair of hand pruners, you know, you can cut a pair of nice cut fairly good. You can see a little bit. This one here is a little bit tougher because it's a little bit harder wood on this choke cherry plant. So they work pretty good. You need a little bit stronger hands. But there are other types like this one here, this ratchet pair of pruners. This is one that you can use a little bit easier. It goes by ratchet, and so you don't need quite as strong of hands. You can just sort of click, 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 and you cut right through it. So that works very well. It's called a ratchet pair of pruners, and they work very well too. And is the biggest thing, like I said, just keep your pruners sharp, and they do a lot for you. Other type of pruners you're going to want to have in your tool shed is things like this pair of loppers. And the loppers are for a little bit bigger branches because you have just a little bit more leverage on them, so you can get around a bigger branch and make a bigger cut. The biggest thing I want to remind people about these pair of loppers is that one thing you got to make sure you do, there's a lot of leverage there. Make sure when you're cutting, cut down straight if you can, because what happens in your body when you're cutting a big branch, you tend to your arms naturally tend to twist because you're making the force. So when you do the twist, what happens is that you're going to end up bending your blades, and then you won't get clean cuts after that. So make sure that you keep your pruners as straight as you can, especially these long loppers, because you want to keep them in good shape so they last for a long, long time. Another tool you can use is this pole pruners. This pole pruners works very well for getting up high. It has a long rope to it, so it has a pair of pruners on the end of it. It can basically do pruning of the smaller branches, and then you can reach it up high and then give a pull on the rope. It cuts it, and also you can attach a small saw to the end so that you actually cut some of the branches and keep both feet on the ground. You don't need to climb a ladder and be able to worry about falling off a ladder. I use this one a lot for pruning fruit trees because there's a lot of small branches where you just can't really get on a ladder and get into the tree, and it's really hard to climb the tree because it's so full of branches. So I use this one a lot for apple trees, plum trees, those kind of things that you can get into the tree and do a really nice job of pruning them and be able to keep your feet on the ground and work quickly and get it done properly. So that works really well. It's called a pole pruner. Another tool that I use a lot is this pair of head shears. Pair of head shears are so nice because you can prune a lot of, obviously, hedges with them, but you can also prune a lot of your shrubs, like your potentillas and spireas, because you can make a nice shape to them. And they're really good for pruning junipers and cedars as well, because instead of a little hand pruner, you're cutting every little tiny branch, you can go up and you can shape them really nice and be able to have a nice job done. There again, making sure that you keep your shears nice and clean all the time, and you also keep them sharp. The reason why we're keeping them clean is that a lot of diseases around the yard you will spread with your tools. So keep them clean, especially if you're talking about apple trees and those type of trees, and even choke cherries. Make sure that you prune them at least after every single tree you move to. So if you go from one apple to another apple, or an apple to a plum, make sure you clean them in between. If you think you have a disease in the tree, then you should be cleaning the pruners almost after every cut, so that you don't spread the disease around the tree. So very important. Another tool I like also for doing a lot of pruning is just a little bow saw. Now they come in different shapes. This is a bow saw, so you can get into a tree and you can do some cuts. And there's other saws that are more just in an arc, and those saws work really good. They have great teeth on them for cutting trees, so it works way better than just a wood hand saw. It cuts nice clean cut, and that's the key, is making a clean cut so that when you do trim them, that the tree will heal properly and be able to do well for you in the years to come. One last tool I have here, this doesn't really do any pruning, but it's for all those people that like to prune their apple trees. And everybody likes to top their apple trees, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But this is a tool I like to use because I don't like topping a tree, but I like thinning a tree a little more. So what happens is you're going to have some apples left over at the top of the tree. So one thing, people hate leaving a few apples because they just can't handle it. They just see them up there and they got to have them. So the best thing to do is leave a couple of these for the birds, or otherwise if you really need to get them, you can use this thing right here. Is basically called an apple picker or a fruit picker. You can reach way up into the tree and it telescopes up as well. And then you can go and you can pick your apples and you don't have to get off the ground, and you can get every single apple even though it might be 12, 14 feet up in the air. So that's a tool that works very well for that as well. So that's the type of tools you can use. So we can start with that. Now we'll get started with some of the pruning we can do. And some of the pruning I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with the evergreens. And so one thing with the evergreens, one thing to remember with those is I like I said, with the globe cedars and those, I like using just a pair of head shears because you can go and you can shape them and get them all around. So one thing we should do, maybe we'll stop right here, because one thing I want to do here is also explain before I go on to the actual demonstrating of pruning, is that I want to talk about, first of all, about the time of year you want to prune. That's so important because there's different times of year to prune different plants. So you want to keep note of this. This is very important. So when you're doing pruning trees, one thing you have to remember is that there's some trees that you want to prune in the summertime, some you want to prune this time of the year, which is basically this time of the year is in March. March is technically the best time of the year to prune a lot of the trees and shrubs. So March and the first week of April, before they start budding out, is a great time. So one thing to remember is that there's a couple trees that you do not want to prune in the spring or even in the fall. So pruning the maples and birches and pines, you want to wait until basically July or August. It's very important because then the saps stop flowing more upwards and they're more staying stabilized in the tree, and then the tree won't bleed and it'll have time to heal up before the next season comes on. So other than that, your shrubs that you don't want to prune this time of the year is, I don't like pruning lilacs or double flowering plum, forsythia, any azaleas or rhododendrons. Those are all plant shrubs that set their blooms in the fall to bloom first thing in the spring. So like the forsythia blooms before even almost the snow disappears in the spring. So if you trim them right this time in March or even in the fall, you're going to cut all your blooms off. So you want to do a trimming on those right about after they finish blooming. So you're talking about in any May and June. Like lilacs will be basically about June to middle of June. As soon as they're finished blooming, give them a light pruning, and then that'll create a lot of new growth for that next year, and then you'll have way more blooms for the following year. If you have to prune your plant, like let's say you got a lilac tree that is 12 feet tall and it's just gotten out of control and you need to bring it down, then you want to do that when it's dormant, so in March and the first week of April, or you can even do it in October as well. Then you want to trim that lilac down to about 6 feet or 5 feet tall. You need to do it when it's dormant. You're not going to worry about the blooms, so then you don't have to worry about you're going to get blooms, but you'll get blooms the following year or the year after. It takes 2 to 3 years for it to restart reblooming. So if you have to do a major pruning, you will have to do it in the dormant season. But most of those double flowering plums, lilacs, if you do all your pruning once a year, do it after they finish blooming. That's the best time to do it. Other types of plants to remember to what time of the year is important is the trees. In a tree, it's called the elm tree. There's lots of elm trees all across Saskatchewan, and they are in every town, every shelter belt, every city on the boulevards and canopy, and so a lot of people like to trim those, but they're in Saskatchewan, we're trying to protect those trees because you can't imagine a place like the cities without the big canopy trees we see along the riverbanks in Saskatoon or down the main streets in Regina or every small town in Saskatchewan. It'd be a shame to lose them because we have a disease called the Dutch elm disease. And what happens when you prune those, when they're in season, like from April until September, they can bleed a bit. And when they bleed a bit, that sap attracts the elm beetle. And so when you attract the elm beetle, you can bring the disease to the plant. So that's why in the province of Saskatchewan, we have a law that says it's a pruning ban on elm trees. You cannot prune them and at all until only from September 1st until April 1st you can prune. So from April 1st to September 1st, you can't prune an elm. And in fact, if you don't even want to store firewood. That's the biggest thing about it. You can't even. It's even illegal in Saskatchewan to cut down a big elm branch, chop it up, and keep it stored in the yard for firewood, because that also will attract the beetle and then could spread the disease around your area, and we just don't want to do that. So any firewood has to be taken to a landfill. It has to be buried, or if you're on an acreage, you have to bury it, or you have to burn it. You have to do something with it. So in mostly the cities and towns, you have a place where you can bring it, and they will actually bury it in a landfill and take care of it for you. So that's basically takes care of the plants that you have a certain time to prune them. All the rest of the plants, you can prune them when they're dormant, and basically I do it anytime in October, November, and then I stop when it's really cold, because I don't like pruning trees when they're really cold, and then I'll start again in March and the first week to 2 weeks in April, depending on the weather, obviously. Some years we got a longer pruning period, and some years we have a less pruning period. So it depends on when the trees start budding out. So your apple trees, your green ash, your poplar trees, your caragana, your linden trees, all those kind of trees you can prune in the dormant period. That's the best time to prune them. And things like all your potentialis, spireas, your 9-barks, your dogwoods, you can prune them also in the dormant season, which is just as soon as the snow disappears in the spring is the best time that you can actually go and trim them and shape them up. So now we'll get back to what we're talking about in doing the pruning. And so when we talked about pruning, here you can see this globe cedar here, and globe cedars come in all different sizes, whether you got this little giant cedar that only grow about 3 feet tall, you got some danicas that only grow 2 feet tall, and then you got the woodwardy globe cedar that grows almost 6 to 8 feet tall. One thing you gotta remember is that, and people ask me, I planted this globe cedar in front of my house 10 years ago, and it's in front of the picture window, and it's covering up half the picture window. Can I cut it down? The answer to that is that if you ever look at a cedar inside, you'll see the inside is all brown and not looking very good inside. Okay, so you can prune a cedar in as far as you still see green. If you prune it in until it still sees brown, then it's going to take about 3 to 5 years for that tree to really fill out again, so it won't look good at all. So the best thing to do, if you got a 6-foot plant and you want to bring it down to 3 feet to get down below your picture window in the front, the best thing to do is just cut it down or take a truck and a chain and yank it out. And then start again with a plant that actually can grow in that area, where if you only want to grow just below the picture window, then use something like this little giant cedar that will only grow that tall. So that's important, and that's to plant the right plant in the right place to start with. Otherwise, if you do have a woodwardy globe cedar that will get 6 feet tall, because you bought it in a little plant, it looked so cute when you bought it, but then all of a sudden it's 6 feet tall, make sure that as it's growing, once you get to the size you want, keep it there. Don't let it get taller. Then you can use that plant in any situation, but it's just a matter of maintaining it at the size you want, rather than letting it grow big and trying to bring it back under control is not as healthy for the plant. Okay, so that's on the globe cedars. A lot of people have the big upright pyramidal cedars, and some like the Brandon cedars or the skybound cedar or the Holmstrup cedar, or even the upright junipers like the Wichita upright juniper or the Medora juniper. Those ones there, the same thing with those. You can take I like using the head shears, and I'll just give them a side pruning to keep them from growing into your stairs or onto your sidewalk. And if you keep them pruned, the same thing there. You can only prune back as far as you still see green, otherwise you won't see very much. And that'll thicken it up as well, so you won't see the brown spots in the middle, because there's no sunlight. That's why you don't see any green branches in the inside for. And a lot of people ask me about their upright cedars. They will have an upright cedar that's growing up 6 feet past the eaves trough, and they want to take it down below the eaves trough. That's not a problem. Just one thing you got to remember is you need to take your loppers or your hand pruners, and what you want to do with the upright cedar, it's going to have about 3 to 5 main stems inside the tree. So what you want to do is you want to take your saw or your loppers or your pruners or whatever you need, depending on the thickness of the branch, and you want to go down to the height you want to bring it down, which is usually about 2 to 3 feet below the eaves trough, and go reach in and cut those big branches off first, okay? Then after you do that, then you want to take your hedge trimmers and then you want to shape it. Because if you just start with your pruners and start working your way across the top, you're going to have what we call a flat top. And it doesn't look natural, and so if you want it to look better, reach in, cut those four main branches off that are up there, and then take your pair of hedge shears and then take all those little tiny branches and then shape them more into a pyramid again so that you have a great looking cedar. And then you start fertilizing it every 3 weeks during the summertime. And what I like using when I'm fertilizing those is I'll just use a 30-10-10, and I'll use that for all my plants that I want to get vigor back onto them again, and do this every 3 weeks from basically May the 10th and stop around July the 15th, and you'll get lots and lots of growth, and then your plants will just fill out again, and especially your cedars and that, they'll fill out way faster than if you don't fertilize them at all. It's like anything. If we set the banquet table in May, if the food is there, it's like us. I mean, I'll get a big belly if I just have food and just keep eating. So I just keep growing. Well, it's the same with the plants. If they got food available and they can just grab it whenever they want, they'll grow like crazy. So if you starve them in between, then they take breaks in the growing season, and you don't want that. You want them to fill out and look good, and they'll stay healthier as well, and then they'll have less diseases as well to be able to, when they stay healthy. So that's important to make sure you fertilize your plants and keep them healthy. So another plant on the evergreen side of it is the junipers. A lot of them are low covering junipers along the ground. And so one thing you got to remember about those low covering junipers is that you can prune the tips off of them very easily, because a lot of times they're going to grow out of your shrub bed and onto your lawn or onto your sidewalk. You can prune them back to the edge. It's not a problem. They'll fill back out again. And so I always say, remember to do a lot of pruning on those as they grow, because what you'll notice with a juniper is that they'll tend to grow branches out and up and touch the ground again. Wherever those junipers touch the ground again, they'll send roots down, and then they'll start again and grow up. So what you want to do is you want to keep them pruned in so that because otherwise what happens is that once they set roots down and start growing back out again, the vigor of the mother plant, the plant that started out, starts losing, and it starts getting bald on the top. So one thing you want to do is you want to make sure that to keep it nice and full is just keep those branches on the outside pruned in, and then you'll keep the plant way nicer and way more vigor. So don't be afraid. That's the number one technical term, I guess. If you take away anything from this video, the number one technical term about any kind of pruning is do not be afraid. Okay? Don't be afraid. Plants love to be pruned, and so pruning your plants all the time, every year, and maintaining pruning is much healthier than doing a massive pruning once every 5 to 10 years, let's say. So you do a little bit of pruning each year. It's just way healthier for the plant to keep it under control before it gets into the situation where the plant is growing where you don't want it to grow. Keep it there before that happens. Even if it's a tiny little branch at the end of a juniper or a tiny little piece of the cedar, prune them off when they're just little, because it's better than if they're big. So that's very good. Also on the evergreens, the last evergreen I want to talk about is the Mugo pines. The Mugo pines is a pine tree. It has longer needles, and a lot of them grow smaller. There's all different varieties. Some grow tall, some grow short, like the pumelo stays a lot shorter, and there's some mini mounds that are even shorter yet. What they do is in June they send up a long candle, and that candle will grow whatever length you want. I mean, it'll grow. Some of the mini ones will only grow short, maybe 4 to 6 inches in a year, and some of the ones like Mugos will grow anywhere from 2 to 3 feet, that candle, that new growth. You'll see that new growth come in June. So what you want to do at that time of the year is whenever the candles start getting pretty long, wherever that candle terminates and stops growing, that's where a new set of branches come out. So when you see the Mugo pines in the garden centers, they're nice and thick and full, and they look beautiful. Well, if you just let them grow on their own, those candles will get long, and then they'll stop growing at the end of the year, and then they'll set another branches out, and you get a lot of this space between the branches, and then that's when you get a more open look of a plant. And so if you don't want the open look, make sure as soon as that candle gets about 3 or 4 inches tall, trim it. Just take your pair of pruners, or just take even your fingers, because they can nip off very easy. Just nip them. That'll terminate where that new growth is. They'll send out an offshoot of side branches, and the side branches now is where it'll start filling in and look a lot thicker. So that's to do with all the junipers and cedars. The only other one we have here is the pine trees, like the spruce trees. Now, one thing about a spruce tree you have to remember is that if you prune a spruce tree and you prune the top of the tree, like the leader, some people decide they don't want it to grow taller anymore. That's okay if you want to do that every year, but as soon as you cut the leader on a spruce tree or a Scotch pine, let's say, what happens is that it will fork off and form 2 leaders. So which is not a problem, but you just have to remember that you can have multiple leaders every time you trim it. So you'll have to go back again, and now next year you're going to have 2 leaders, and once you cut those 2 leaders, the following year you're going to have 4 leaders, etc. It just keeps going and going. So the best thing to do is not to touch the leader, but touch everything below the leader. You can trim the sides and keep that plant so it's not getting too wide. If you decide you have a spruce tree that I don't want it to get any taller, that's fine. Just prune it off the top, but then make sure that you keep at that every year. And the side, people ought to ask me, the big spruce trees, should I prune the spruce trees so the branches are up off the ground? And that's probably the biggest question I have for that. That is basically a decision on looks. So it's aesthetics completely. So you have to decide whether you want space underneath the tree. Maybe it's because there's a sidewalk close by and you want to walk through, or maybe it's because you just want to plant something underneath there. Well, there's one thing about that is that you got to remember that once you prune a spruce tree up, there's less sunlight and there's more competition for moisture underneath there. Nothing's going to grow underneath there. So once people ask me, can I grow anything underneath the spruce tree? And I say yes. You can put some mulch down, put some cedar mulch down, and basically after that, put a planter in there and plant some flowers like some begonias or impatiens or Gerber daisies, things that will grow, flowers that grow in the shade in a container. But if you plant them in the ground and you dig a hole and you put some nice soil in them and a nice little perennial or a little juniper or even some grass seed, and you start watering and fertilizing it, that spruce tree is going to say, oh my, thank you very much. It sends roots in there, it'll just choke that plant out within a year or 2. So my suggestion is that there's 2 ways you can do it. One, you can just leave the branches right down to the ground. If you do want it pruned up, then just mulch it and just put some containers underneath there and get your color and flowering other plants underneath it that way. One thing you got to watch while I have this in my hand for is there's 2 things you got to watch for evergreens that everybody asks me on the evergreens. Why is the inside of the plant losing all its needles for? And there's 2 reasons for that. Number one is because there's less light in there, so they will drop naturally. The other one is spider mite. This one branch I have here, a sample of, it has spider mite on it, and so what happens, you can just see all the inside. Spider mite work, they basically bite into the needles and they suck the juices out, and then the needles basically desiccate, they dry up and then fall off. So you can see this branch here, it had a lot of spider mite on, so you can see all the branches here, they got no needles left on them, and as you get more needles as you move out to the edge of the plant. So what you want to do with that is the one way you can control those spider mites is that make sure you're keeping your plants fertilized. I don't care if that spruce tree's 30 feet tall, okay? It still needs food. I'm 60 years old, so I don't know what the deal is. I got to eat 3 times a day. So what's the deal with that? Well, a tree that's 60 years old still needs to have food. So you still need to fertilize the plant and basically keep it food. That'll keep it healthier, keep lots of growth and vigor on the outside so that you don't see a lot of the needles that have fallen off on the inside. That's important. The other thing you do to be able to control the spider mites is, one, just blast cold water. Spider mites don't like cold water being blasted on them, so you can control them that way. But the other way you can control them is just using a product called malathion. And malathion, you still have to mask up and wear gloves and those kind of things. And the best way to do that is using this hose end sprayer, because you can actually hook it onto the garden hose, you can blast it right into the tree. And you need to spray them 3 times, starting around June 1st, every 14 days for 3 times. And then you'll get the controls. You don't need to get rid of all the spider mite. You just need to bring the populations down so that the tree can withstand. It's just when you get a huge population, the tree can't take the amount of stress it is from so many insects, and that's why you start losing a lot of the needles. So that's important. The other one you have to watch for that's happening around Saskatchewan a lot is that you're going to start seeing these brown needles in patches all through the trees, right to the tips. Spider mite works from the inside, bottom, up and out. To spider mite, all the needles fall off. But if you start seeing these brown branches all through and different spots all through the tree, even at the top, then you probably have a problem called needle cast disease. So needle cast disease is a fungal, and it spreads by rain splashing on it. It'll work its way down. Let's say you have a farm acreage, and you have a whole row of them, or even a few trees in your yard. It'll work from tree to tree to tree, and it'll just be like wildfire. It'll just work its way down. So if you do have that, best thing to do is bring a sample into a garden center in your local area, and they can diagnose to make sure that's what it is. But if you do end up having it, then you need to start spraying with Bordeaux or copper spray. And you need to spray that every 3 weeks, again, from about June the 1st right through the summer, about every 3 weeks, and then you'll keep it under control. There again, fertilizing it, so getting it healthy and watering it. We've had a drought in the last few years, so you got to watch for that, is that you got to keep them watered. I know that's hard if you got a row of 100 feet of pine trees or spruce trees, but if you have a big sprayer tank that you go and haul to your sprayers out in the farm, you can use that to go and water your plants as well. And spray them thoroughly using also a sprayer like this where you can hook onto the end, or if you got a whole bunch of rows of trees, you can use one of your farm sprayers as well, as long as it's cleaned out really well, and you can spray them. There's even some farmers that have gone so much because they got together with a few of them, because out in their crops they're using an airplane to spray the crops anyways, so they go and hire an airplane and they spray all the trees, and that's why they can get a row of 30-foot-old legacy trees that have been on the farm forever and they don't want to lose them. So it's worthwhile spraying them, even if they have to hire an airplane to spray them. And it works very well because that spray gets right into the canopy of the tree and it controls the fungal. Other trees I want to talk about here is pruning. It's pruning actually trees. And so when you're pruning the trees, one thing you got to remember is that this one here is a choke cherry. When you're pruning a choke cherry, you got to remember this. One thing important is that this here is called it's basically called black knot, or I call it doggy doo-doo in a tree, okay? Because that's what it looks like. It looks like doggy doo-doo in a tree. So one thing you do is this black knot, it spreads in basically the last couple weeks of April and into May. So this is the seed pod. So this black right here is the seed pod. So when they open up and they shoot microscopic spores into the air and they're carried by the wind. And especially in the spring when you get some moisture in the mornings, from the dew and also from little rains in the spring, it coats the branches, and so when this spreads around into the tree itself, or to the neighbor's tree or to other trees around, they cling to that wet bark, and then they'll start growing within 2 to 4 hours. They'll start growing, and then you'll have even worse problem you did the last year, just like this one here. And so one thing I remember about pruning the black knot is that make sure when you prune the black knot that you prune quite a ways away from the black knot itself. If you prune it so like you prune right close by, what will happen is that I've just contaminated my pruners. So now I'll have to go and disinfect them. Now disinfecting the pruners, you can use anything from an alcohol, just dip them in alcohol, or you can use a 30% bleach and 70% water. Now there's one thing I'll talk about when you're using bleach. It works very well for dipping your pruners into. And I just have a little cottage cheese container or something like that. For some of your bigger pruners or even your saws, I'll have a little spritzer bottle and I'll spray them in some paper towel to wipe them off with. But once you're finished with them, after you finish doing a pruning, the bleach is very hard on stainless steel. It'll start pitting it. So what you want to do is take your tools into the house, use some soap and water, clean them off very well, and put some vegetable oil, canola oil, olive oil, just put a light coating on them, and then that will keep them so they'll keep nice and fresh and not stiff, and they won't rust up on you, and that works very well. And it's organic, most of those vegetable oils, so it's perfect to use and it's good to do. So just make sure that you don't prune too close to any disease spots. And then this one here, you just can't throw it on the ground. You got to basically get that out of the yard, because that will, if you throw that into the compost, that'll still spread spores around, so you don't want to have that around, or insects will spread the spores around. So you want to make sure you get all those right out of the yard. So what I say, when do you want to prune? When you see the black knot? Whenever you see it. I don't care what time of the year is. If you see some black knot forming, prune it. If you see it getting into the main trunk, then there's not much you can do. I have taken a knife, a utility knife, and chisels and cleaned it out, and then sprayed it down with some pruning paint, and then I've been able to save it for a while. But once it's in the main trunk, it tends to get right into the sap system of the tree, and then it's pretty much the time when you need to cut off the tree and start again. But otherwise, if you prune all this off, this one here, it has so much black knot, I wouldn't even try saving this tree because it's right throughout the whole tree. So this tree is not going to be savable. If you're out in the country and it's out in the wild bush, just cut it off because it'll sucker from the bottom and start again. That's one thing you got to remember about choke cherries. When you cut them off, they will sucker like crazy and come back again. One other thing you can do when you've got the black knot in the tree, you can prevent it by spraying in the spring, early spring. You can spray it with dormant oil. So as soon as it's above 0, you can put this kit, it's lime sulfur and dormant oil, and you can spray that on, and it keeps the tree from getting the fungus again. So if you think your neighbors have the plant and you're worried about yours getting it, you can spray with this. Or if you prune all these pieces of doggy-doo out of the tree and you don't want to spread more into the tree, you can spray it with this called this dormant oil kit. So that works very well. Also now we're going to pretend that this tree is an apple tree. And so one thing you want to remember about an apple tree is there's different ways you want to prune it. You want to take any crossing branches, any branches that are crossing each other and growing into each other, just like this branch right here that might be crossing and growing into the other branch, like this one. So you can prune some of the branches that are pruning, even it doesn't matter how small they are. If it looks like it's going to cause a problem, just like this one right here, it might cause not a problem right now, but it might cause a problem in a year or so. Prune it when it's small rather than when it gets big. So, and also what happens with apple trees is that they tend to get what we call a water sprout. Water sprout is when a branch grows out of the main trunk, and a lot of times from down, a lot lower down, and it grows up and through the middle of the tree. So it'll grow up and through the middle of the tree just like this. So that's going to cause a problem in here because all these branches are going to start rubbing, and when they rub, they cause a scar, and then that's places where diseases and insects get in. And one thing about an apple tree, you want to make sure it doesn't get fire blight, and so that's an important way of just keeping it nice and clean. So what I would suggest to you, if you've got a water sprout like that, is just prune that branch right out, and then so that way you can pull it out, and then that way you don't have it causing a problem. Next thing you want to do is that once you've taken all the cross branches out, you've taken any of the suckers that are coming from the ground, you can take them off. Next thing you want to do is just stand back and you want to shape the tree. So you can, one branch, maybe every year you're cutting the grass and it keeps knocking your hat off your head. So maybe you decide you want to cut that off. So maybe this is a good time when the plant is dormant, is either cut that branch back or even take it off completely. And so one thing I remember about when you cut off a plant, as long as it's, I always say, as long as it's under 2 inches in size, if it's under that, just leave them, they'll heal on their own. If it starts getting over 2 inches in size, I suggest just leave them for at least 2 to 3 weeks to let them dry out, and then you can take a pruning paint, and then you can spray them with a pruning paint. That'll seal it up so that that wood is protected, just like you would be staining or painting your fence, so that the wood doesn't rot in the center. The outside edge will get covered up with bark, but the center core could rot, and then it rots right into the trunk of the tree, so you want to protect it and keep it from rotting inside the tree. So apple trees, otherwise a lot of people like doing, like I talked way earlier about when we talked about the type of tools, a lot of people like taking their apple tree and they just like, they just like cutting the top off. And so they'll cut all the top of the branches off, the top of the tree. And the reason they do that is because they just don't want to, they want to be able to reach all the apples on the tree. The only problem with that is that when you cut that, every place I cut, I'm going to get 2 to 3, sometimes 4 branches growing up. So when I have that happen, they're going to grow, they're going to have what's called water sprouts. They're going to grow about 3 or 4 feet tall, and they're going to have giant leaves on them. They're going to shade the tree, and all those big leaves are just going to take energy away from the tree. So I suggest just let the tree grow up to its height. Use that basket that I was telling you to reach them with, and go up there and now thin the tree out. Some of the orchards out in British Columbia and that, they do plard the tree so they can get at them easier. But then they have arborists that go in during the season, and when they start setting up their shoots, they'll go and thin them again to 1 rather than having 4. So you can do that, but it's a lot of work to do it in season. So if you just want to prune it once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, just thin out the top so that you have less branches up there, you have less apples up there, but the tree will grow to its natural state and it'll be healthier and way better for it. A rule of thumb for trees, you can take up to 1/3 of the canopy, and that's healthy for the tree. Anything more than that is starting to get unhealthy for the tree. So 1/3 of the canopy, you'll be fine, and you can thin out this tree, get more light, and all those spurs that you'll get growing, you'll get a lot more apples right down inside the tree as well. And that goes with apples, plums, pears, doesn't matter. Any type of fruit tree is all the same. And the same thing with lindens and ash trees. There again, you can prune them so that whether the branch has been bothering you or is growing over top of the garden and shading, you can prune them. You can prune them when they're in the dormant state, and then just make sure if you've got a big branch, like it's big, like it's over 3 inches or bigger in diameter, make sure that you start pruning your branch from way out and then bring it in, so that your final cut is only about 1 foot to 18 inches long. On a big branch that might be 6-8 inches, there might be a lot of weight there. And what happens is if you start cutting a big branch with a chainsaw, let's say right at the trunk of the tree, what can happen is that what'll happen is that the weight could take the branch and rip it right down the trunk. And so you don't want to be able to rip it down the trunk, and in a big tree it can be a big rip. And so you don't want that, so cut your branches back slowly and then make your final cut an undercut and then a top cut, and you only got a small piece that you can actually handle and not have all that weight to be able to damage the tree when you're pruning it. The other plants we have right now is things like your shrubs, your dogwoods and potentillas. So what I want to do with dogwoods and potentillas, I like to prune them when they're dormant. So one thing I remember about dogwoods and potentillas is that there is a lot of space that is in between. This is a lilac branch, but I'm just going to give you the same kind of demonstration. There's a lot of space between the branches where the next set of branches come. So one thing you got to remember about dogwoods, if you prune a dogwood and you prune it so that when I prune it off and I prune it, let's say here, and I leave that little stub sticking up, what happens when I leave that little stub sticking up, that stub will die down. And especially on dogwoods, they'll turn black, and they just got all these black little tips all over the place. So cut them just above where one of those branches are, and you won't get all those black stubs. So that's with dogwoods, lilacs, cranberries, anything that has a lot of space between where the leaves come out of the branch. Be a little bit picky about where you're going to prune them. Now you can do a major pruning first and then go back and just clean them up afterwards if you want, but that's a good way to do it. So on those ones there, like dogwoods and 9-barks, I like to prune them right back. If they're 6-8 feet tall, bring them down to about 3 or 4 feet tall. They'll look way better, they'll be healthier, and 9-barks love to be pruned. So do dogwoods. So don't be afraid, but if their branches are like on a dogwood are starting to get white and gray, what I like doing is every year I'll take one of the big branches out. I'm going to have a bit of a hole in my plant because there's multiple of these branches, but that'll fill in like crazy with these brand new red branches. And then the next year I'll take another one out, and the next year I'll take another one out, and now I'll just keep that circulation going, so I'm always rejuvenating a plant. So that's important. So on roses I like to prune my rose plants back at least 25% every spring. And the reason why I prune them in the spring is I want all these branches sticking up through the snow. They catch a lot of more snow, and then when they catch more snow, they'll be more protected, because snow is a huge insulator. Okay, so what you want to do is prune your roses back at least 1/3, 25 to 30% in the spring. Because you make that pruning, you get a lot of secondary branches, and you'll get a lot more blooms. Most roses bloom on new wood. There's only a few roses, especially like Persian yellow and Teresa Bugnet, they bloom on their old flowers. So if you do pruning every year, you're not going to have as many flowers. But most of them will have all the new roses will bloom on new wood. So it's not a problem. Cut them back 1/3. As soon as the snow disappears, and when they're still dormant yet, give them back a pruning. Also, what you want to do is things like potentillas and spireas. This is important. What I like doing, I like every spring or every fall, I'll give them a shaping. So I'll cut all the old flowers off the potentillas or spireas where they get all that flower on the top and they look all brown. I'll go and cut them back once a year, just shape them. Every 3rd or 4th year, this is where that technical term I was talking to you about earlier, about the best one is do not be afraid. That's the best technical pruning term I can give you today, is do not be afraid. So if you've got things like potentillas and spireas, every 3rd or 4th year, go and take it, trim it right down. Like I said, don't be afraid. Trim it right down. That plant, by the middle to end of June, it'll be up about 2 to 3 feet tall. By July, it'll be 3 feet tall and blooming like crazy. So don't be afraid in your potentillas and spireas. And the same thing with dogwoods and 9-barks. Don't be afraid to cut them down in half or 1/3 they'll love it, and they'll do way better for you than being all sprawling and all over the place. So the other plants I want to talk, most people ask me about, is things like Saskatoons or fruit trees. I like pruning the fruit trees when they're dormant. So like Saskatoons, you want to do it in the spring again in March and April. It's sour cherries. They love to be pruned as well. Prune them out, especially if they get any disease, you get any oozing out of the branches. Prune that off as soon as you see it, or otherwise this time of the year. Any of your Saskatoons, what you can do with those is that you can't, sometimes Saskatoons get 12 feet tall and all the berries at the top. Cut it down to 6 feet tall. You won't get as many berries the first year, but the second year when it starts filling out, you'll get way more berries. So don't be afraid, again, the Saskatoons, currants and gooseberries, all the same thing. Give them a good little bit of pruning in the spring and they'll do way better. Raspberries produce fruit on their second year canes. So anytime it's produced for the third or fourth year, you should actually prune those right out. And you'll rejuvenate your crop. It'll always suck up from the bottom and you'll always have great fruit. So that's important. Last one I'm going to talk about right today is about vines. A lot of people have vines growing on fences and those kind of things, like your Virginia creeper, your native grape, your clematis, those kind of things. A lot of times, because most of them are hardy, you don't need to do anything with them. But if they start getting out of control, you can cut them back in half to a third. Doesn't matter. I've even cut my 12-foot grapes down to 3 feet off the ground. By the end of the next summer, they're back up to 12 feet tall again. So it's not a problem with those. They'll love it. Just make sure you give it some fertilizer in the summertime, and they'll be great. So that does most of the basic things about pruning. You can always stop in at your local garden center, and you can always get some little more expert advice as you need it on specific plants. But that gives you basics. So thank you for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the pruning seminar, and have a great spring. It's going to be a good one.